The gentle whir of the gramophone fills the parlor with a melancholic melody as we fade in. A sepia-toned photograph appears. 6 children arranged in a perfect row, their faces frozen in time, wearing their Sunday best against a painted backdrop of rolling hills. In the spring of 1912, when the world still maintained its innocence before the Great War, a peculiar event unfolded in the sleepy town of Thornfield, nestled in the misty valleys of northern England. The townsfolk would later struggle to recall exactly when the strangeness began, but most agreed it coincided with the arrival of Mr. Edmund Clark, a traveling photographer from London. Edmund Clark stepped off the train at Thornfield Station on April 12th, the same day newspapers announced the tragic sinking of the Titanic. While the world mourned the maritime disaster, Clark barely noticed the headlines. His mind was occupied with more practical matters, securing lodging, setting up his mobile studio, and most importantly, finding clients among Thornfield's wealthiest families. Photography in 1912 was still something of a novelty in rural communities. The cumbersome equipment, delicate glass plates, and mysterious chemicals made photographers seem like modern-day alchemists, capable of capturing souls within paper rectangles. Clark had built a respectable reputation in London for his portraits, particularly those of children. There was something in his manner that put young subjects at ease, allowing him to capture genuine expressions rather than the stiff, somber faces that characterized most photographs of the era. The bell above the door to Clark's temporary studio jingled as a woman entered, her high-collared dress and carefully arranged hair marking her as a member of Thornfield's upper class. She introduced herself as Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, wife of the town's most prominent industrialist. The Blackwoods owned the textile mill that employed half the town, and their grand house on the hill overlooked Thornfield like a watchful guardian. "Mr. Clark," she spoke with precise diction, "I understand you specialize in portraits of children." Clark nodded, gesturing to the samples displayed on the walls. "Indeed, madam. I believe I have a particular talent for capturing the innocence of youth." Mrs. Blackwood studied the photographs with a critical eye before speaking again. "My husband and I have been blessed with 6 children. We would like a family portrait to commemorate my eldest son's departure for boarding school next month." Clark's eyes lit up at the prospect of such a substantial commission. 6 children from the wealthiest family in town would not only provide generous payment, but would serve as an excellent advertisement for his services. "I would be honored, Mrs. Blackwood. When would you like to schedule the sitting?" "Tomorrow afternoon at Blackwood Manor, 2 o'clock precisely." She handed him a calling card with the address embossed in elegant script. "The children will be prepared and dressed appropriately. My husband insists on punctuality, Mr. Clark." The following day, Edmund Clark loaded his equipment onto a hired cart and made his way up the winding road to Blackwood Manor. The house emerged from the morning mist like a cathedral of brick and stone, its numerous chimneys reaching toward the cloudy sky. The gardens surrounding the mansion were immaculately maintained, with perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds arranged in geometric patterns. A butler received Clark at the door, his expression as starched as his collar. "Mrs. Blackwood is expecting you, sir. Please follow me to the conservatory where the sitting will take place." The conservatory was a marvel of iron and glass, filled with exotic plants and bathed in natural light, ideal conditions for photography. Clark began setting up his equipment, carefully arranging his camera on its tripod and preparing the glass plates that would capture the Blackwood children's images. At precisely 2 o'clock, Mrs. Blackwood entered the conservatory, followed by a procession of 6 children arranged in descending order of height. They moved with practiced coordination, suggesting this was not their first formal portrait. "My children, Mr. Clark," Mrs. Blackwood announced with undisguised pride. "William, age 12, Eleanor, age 10, Frederick, age 8, the twins, Margaret and Catherine, age 6, and little Henry, age 4. Clark observed the children with a professional eye. They were remarkably similar in appearance, all bearing the Blackwood features: straight noses, high foreheads, and piercing blue eyes. Their clothing was impeccable, the boys in sailor suits with short pants and polished shoes, the girls in white pinafores with matching ribbons in their dark hair. As Clark greeted each child, he noticed something peculiar about Frederick, the 3rd child. Unlike his siblings, who stood with perfect posture and responded with rehearsed politeness, Frederick seemed distracted, his eyes constantly drifting toward the large windows that overlooked the garden. There was something else about the boy that Clark couldn't quite identify. a subtle difference that distinguished him from his siblings. "Now then," Clark said, adopting the cheerful tone he reserved for young subjects, "I'd like you all to stand in a row, tallest to shortest. William, you'll be on the far left, and little Henry on the far right." Mrs. Blackwood supervised the arrangement, making minute adjustments to collars, smoothing hair, and reminding the children to stand straight. Clark ducked under the black cloth behind his camera, examining the composition through the lens. The children were perfectly arranged, but something still caught his attention about Frederick. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, emerging from behind the camera, "I believe young Frederick's left shoe has come unlaced. Perhaps it could be fixed before we proceed." Mrs. Blackwood's expression flickered for just a moment, so briefly that Clark might have imagined it, before she turned to examine Frederick's shoe. The boy's left foot was indeed improperly dressed, the laces of his polished boot undone and trailing on the floor. "Frederick," she said, her voice carrying a note that made the other children stiffen imperceptibly, "what did I tell you about presenting yourself properly?" "I'm sorry, Mother," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It keeps coming undone." Mrs. Blackwood knelt and tied the lace with quick, efficient movements. "There. Now remain perfectly still for Mr. Clark." Clark returned to his camera, but as he peered through the lens, he noticed Frederick's gaze still fixed on something outside the window. Following the boy's line of sight, Clark saw nothing but the empty garden, shrouded in the mist that had begun to descend. "Frederick," Clark called gently, "please look toward the camera like your brothers and sisters." The boy's head turned slowly, and for the first time, his eyes met Clark's through the lens. A chill ran down the photographer's spine, while the other Blackwood children's eyes were bright with childish anticipation. Frederick's held something else, something that seemed out of place in an 8-year-old boy. "Splendid," Clark said, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. "Now everyone, please hold very still. This exposure will take several seconds." The children remained motionless as statues while Clark exposed the plate. As he was about to signal the end of the exposure, he noticed Frederick's left shoe. The lace had come undone again, though the boy hadn't moved an inch. Clark took several more photographs, arranging the children in different poses, standing, seated on elegant chairs, gathered around a small table with a vase of flowers. Throughout the session, Frederick's shoelace repeatedly came undone, despite being tied securely between each exposure. As Clark was packing his equipment, Mrs. Blackwood approached him. "When might we expect to see the portraits, Mr. Clark?" "I shall develop them this evening, madam. You may come to the studio tomorrow afternoon to view the results." Mrs. Blackwood nodded. "Excellent. My husband will be most pleased." As Clark was escorted to the door, he passed a long gallery of family portraits dating back generations. He paused before a particularly large painting depicting what must have been Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood with their children several years earlier. "This is quite beautiful," Clark remarked to the butler. "The Blackwood family has a fine tradition of portraiture." The butler glanced at the painting. "Indeed, sir. That was commissioned 5 years ago, shortly before young Master Frederick came to live with the family." Clark's brow furrowed in confusion. "Came to live with the family? But I thought he was—" "Master Frederick is Mrs. Blackwood's nephew, sir," the butler explained. "He came to live at Blackwood Manor after his parents, Mrs. Blackwood's sister and her husband, perished in a house fire. The family doesn't speak of it. If you'll follow me, sir." Clark glanced back at the painting as he left, noting that indeed, it showed only 5 children. Frederick was absent. That evening, in his rented rooms above the town's pharmacy, Clark worked in the makeshift darkroom he had established in the bathroom. The familiar process of developing photographs usually brought him a sense of calm, but tonight, his mind kept returning to Frederick Blackwood and his perpetually unlaced shoe. As the images began to appear on the paper, immersed in the chemical bath, Clark scrutinized each one by the dim red light. The Blackwood children emerged from the photographic paper like ghosts materializing from the ether. First William, straight-backed and solemn, Eleanor, with her serene smile, the twins, identical in their perfect posture, and little Henry, round-cheeked and bright-eyed. But when Frederick's image appeared, Clark nearly dropped the paper into the chemical bath. While the other children appeared normal, Frederick's image was subtly distorted. His outline seemed slightly blurred as though he had moved during the exposure, though Clark was certain the boy had remained as still as his siblings. And there, just as Clark had noticed during the sitting, was the unlaced left shoe. But there was something else, something Clark hadn't noticed at Blackwood Manor. Looking closely at Frederick's left foot, He could see that the shoe did not rest flat on the floor like the others. Instead, it hovered perhaps half an inch above the ground, as though Frederick were floating ever so slightly. "Impossible," Clark muttered, lifting the print from the bath and hanging it to dry. He examined the other photographs, finding the same anomaly in each one. In every image, Frederick's left foot with its unlaced shoe did not quite touch the ground. Clark wondered if there could be some flaw in his camera or process, but the other children appeared perfectly normal. It was only Frederick who seemed to defy the laws of nature, and only his left foot at that. Troubled by what he had discovered, Clark struggled to sleep that night. His dreams were filled with images of the Blackwood children standing in a row, all smiling except for Frederick, whose eyes followed Clark with unsettling intensity. The next morning, Clark woke to the sound of rain against his window. The weather had turned, bringing a damp chill that seeped through the walls of the old building. He dressed quickly and went downstairs to the pharmacy, where he purchased a bottle of tonic for his nerves before returning to examine the photographs once more. In the clear light of day, the anomalies in Frederick's image remained. Clark prepared the photographs for Mrs. Blackwood's viewing, mounting them on stiff cardboard frames as was his custom. As he worked, he debated whether to mention the peculiarities he had noticed. Perhaps there was a simple explanation, a trick of the light or some imperfection in his equipment. At precisely 3 o'clock, the bell above the studio door announced Mrs. Blackwood's arrival. She was accompanied by her husband, a stern-faced man with a waxed mustache and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mr. Clark," Mrs. Blackwood said, "allow me to introduce my husband, Richard Blackwood." Clark shook hands with the industrialist, noting the man's firm grip and assessing gaze. "A pleasure, sir. I have the photographs ready for your inspection." The Blackwoods followed Clark to a small viewing table where he had arranged the mounted photographs. Mrs. Blackwood examined each one carefully, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "They are quite good," she said finally. "You've captured the children's likenesses remarkably well." Mr. Blackwood leaned forward to study one of the photographs. "Indeed, very satisfactory." Clark hesitated, then pointed to Frederick's image in the group portrait. "I noticed something unusual about young Frederick's photograph. His left shoe appears to be—" "The boy has difficulty with his laces," Mr. Blackwood interrupted, his tone brooking no further discussion. "A minor imperfection in an otherwise excellent portrait." "Of course," Clark replied, though he wanted to point out that it wasn't just the lace that concerned him, but the apparent levitation of the boy's foot. However, something in Mr. Blackwood's expression discouraged further comment. The Blackwoods selected several portraits to be framed and made arrangements for payment. As they were about to leave, Clark found himself asking a question before he could reconsider. "I understand Frederick came to live with you after a tragedy. It speaks well of your family's compassion." The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. Mr. Blackwood's face darkened, and Mrs. Blackwood's hand froze on the door handle. "Who told you that?" Mr. Blackwood demanded, his voice low. "Your butler mentioned it in passing," Clark replied, immediately regretting his words. "I apologize if I've spoken out of turn." Mr. Blackwood stepped closer to Clark, his presence suddenly intimidating despite his refined appearance. "My family's affairs are not a subject for casual conversation, Mr. Clark. I would appreciate your discretion in this matter." "Of course, sir. I meant no offense." After the Blackwoods departed, Clark found himself unable to focus on his work. The encounter had left him unsettled, and he could not shake the image of Frederick's hovering shoe from his mind. On impulse, he locked the studio and walked to the local public house, hoping a pint of ale might calm his nerves. The Thornfield Arms was nearly empty at that hour, with only a few patrons scattered among the wooden tables. Clark took a seat at the bar and ordered his drink, then turned to survey the room. His gaze fell on an elderly man sitting alone in the corner, nursing a glass of whiskey. Something about the man's solitary figure called to Clark, and after retrieving his ale, he approached the stranger's table. "Mind if I join you?" Clark asked. The old man gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Be my guest?" Clark introduced himself, explaining that he was a photographer temporarily working in Thornfield. The old man nodded, identifying himself as Dr. Thomas Harris, retired physician to the Thornfield community. "A photographer, eh?" Dr. Harris said, his rheumy eyes brightening with interest. "I imagine the Blackwoods have already commissioned you. They never miss an opportunity to document their dynasty." "Indeed," Clark replied, seeing an opening to satisfy his curiosity. "I photographed their children yesterday. A handsome family. Dr. Harris made a non-committal sound. Handsome indeed and powerful. Richard Blackwood owns half the county and employs most of the town. Not a man to cross, Mr. Clark. I gathered as much, Clark said, taking a sip of his ale. I understand they took in their nephew after some tragedy. Dr. Harris's expression changed, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. Is that what they're saying now? That Frederick is their nephew? Clark leaned forward, intrigued by the man's reaction. Is he not? The doctor glanced around the pub before lowering his voice. The official story is that Frederick is Victoria Blackwood's nephew, the son of her sister who died in a house fire in Scotland. But I've been physician to every family in this town for 40 years before my retirement, and I can tell you Victoria Blackwood never had a sister. Clark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp weather. Then who is Frederick? Dr. Harris drained his whiskey and signaled the barkeeper for another. That's the question, isn't it? The boy appeared at Blackwood Manor nearly 5 years ago. One day he wasn't there, and the next, the family was introducing him as their son, their third child, though anyone who had seen the family before knew they had only 5 children then. But surely people ask questions. Some did at first, but the Blackwoods have a way of making problems disappear. Questions about Frederick stopped rather abruptly when the schoolteacher who had inquired too persistently found herself dismissed and her family evicted from their cottage on Blackwood land. Clark considered this information, trying to reconcile it with what he had observed. There's something unusual about the boy. In the photographs I took, his left foot appears to be... He trailed off, unsure how to describe what he had seen without sounding mad. Appears to be what? Dr. Harris pressed. Not touching the ground, Clark finished, expecting ridicule. Instead, the doctor's face paled. The left foot, you say? With an unlaced shoe? Clark stared at the old man. Yes. How did you know? Dr. Harris pushed his empty glass aside and leaned closer. There's a story in these parts, Mr. Clark. An old legend about a creature called a changeling, a fairy child left in place of a human child stolen by the Fey folk. Such creatures often have physical signs marking them as not quite human. In the old tales, one such sign is a foot that never quite touches the earth. Clark laughed nervously. Surely you don't believe in such superstitions, Doctor. You're a man of science. I was a man of science for 40 years, and in that time I saw things that defied explanation. Dr. Harris replied seriously. I'm not saying Frederick Blackwood is a changeling. I'm merely pointing out a curious coincidence. The conversation turned to other matters, but Clark could not dismiss the doctor's words as easily as he would have liked. That night, he dreamed again of the Blackwood children. But this time, Frederick stood apart from his siblings, his left foot raised as if taking a step toward Clark, his shoe unlaced, and his eyes filled with an ancient knowledge no child should possess. The following morning, Clark awoke to find a note had been slipped under his door. It was written on expensive stationery, the Blackwood family crest embossed at the top. The message was brief. Mr. Clark, I request your presence at Blackwood Manor this afternoon at 4 o'clock. I wish to discuss a private commission. Please bring your equipment. Victoria Blackwood. Clark's first instinct was to decline, but curiosity overcame his unease. He spent the morning preparing his camera and supplies, then hired the same cart to take him up to Blackwood Manor just before 4. The manor looked different in the cold light of a cloudy day. The grandeur remained, but there was something forbidding about its tall windows and ornate stonework. Clark was admitted by the same butler, who led him not to the conservatory, but to a part of the house he had not seen before. They descended a flight of stairs to what appeared to be the servants' quarters, then continued along a narrow corridor that seemed to lead toward the back of the property. Finally, they reached a small door, which the butler opened to reveal a staircase leading further down. Mrs. Blackwood is waiting for you in the old nursery, sir, the butler said, handing Clark a kerosene lamp. Mind your step on the stairs. Clark hesitated. The old nursery is in the basement. The original house was much smaller, sir. When the current manor was built around it, parts of the old structure remained below ground. The old nursery is one such room. Gathering his courage, Clark descended the stairs, balancing his equipment and the lamp. The air grew cooler and damper with each step, carrying a musty scent of age and disuse. At the bottom, he found himself in another corridor with several doors. One stood ajar, a faint light visible within. Mrs. Blackwood, Clark called, approaching the open door. In here, Mr. Clark. Clark entered what indeed appeared to be a nursery, though unlike any he had seen before. The room was circular, with stone walls covered in faded murals depicting scenes from children's stories. A collection of antique toys lined shelves along the walls, dolls with porcelain faces, wooden soldiers, and clockwork animals frozen in time. In the center of the room stood a large rocking horse, its paint chipped and its glass eyes reflecting the lamplight with an unnerving gleam. Mrs. Blackwood stood by a small window set high in the wall, which allowed a meager amount of daylight into the space. She turned as Clark entered, her face partially shadowed. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Clark. I apologize for the unusual setting, but what I wish to discuss is a matter of some sensitivity." Clark set down his equipment, keeping the lamp close. "How may I be of service, Mrs. Blackwood?" She gestured to a door on the far side of the room. "Through there is a small bedchamber where Frederick sleeps when he requires solitude. I would like you to photograph him there, alone." Clark frowned. "The boy sleeps in the basement, separate from the other children?" "Frederick is not like the other children, as I believe you have already noticed." Mrs. Blackwood's voice held no emotion. "My husband and I have done our best for him, but his condition requires special arrangements." "His condition?" Clark repeated, remembering the hovering shoe. "Frederick suffers from sleepwalking and night terrors," Mrs. Blackwood explained. "For his safety and that of the other children, we found it best to provide him with separate sleeping quarters." The explanation seemed reasonable, yet Clark sensed there was more to the story. "And why do you want him photographed here?" Mrs. Blackwood moved toward the inner door. "My husband is a practical man, Mr. Clark. He concerns himself with business and leaves the children's upbringing to me. This photograph is for my private collection, a mother's sentiment, if you will." She opened the door to reveal a small, sparsely furnished room containing a narrow bed, a chair, and a chest of drawers. There was no window, and the only light came from an oil lamp on a small table. Sitting on the bed was Frederick, still dressed in the sailor suit he had worn for the portrait, his left shoe conspicuously unlaced. "Frederick," Mrs. Blackwood said, "Mr. Clark is going to take your photograph. You will do exactly as he instructs." The boy nodded without speaking. His face seemed paler than Clark remembered, his blue eyes larger and more luminous in the dim light. Mrs. Blackwood turned to Clark. "I shall leave you to your work. When you have finished, ring the bell by the stairs and the butler will escort you out. I have arranged payment for this private commission on the table there." Before Clark could respond, she had swept from the room, closing the nursery door behind her. Clark stood awkwardly for a moment, then began setting up his camera, feeling Frederick's eyes following his every movement. "Well then, young man," Clark said, trying to sound cheerful, "shall we create a fine portrait for your mother?" Frederick did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "She is not my mother." Clark's hands froze on his camera. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Blackwood. She is not my mother." Frederick's expression remained unchanged. "My mother is waiting for me to return." A chill ran down Clark's spine. "Return where, Frederick?" The boy's gaze shifted to the stone wall as though looking through it, to the hollow hill, beyond the ancient oak, where the door opens only under the midnight moon. Clark told himself the boy was simply repeating lines from some fairy tale, yet the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He focused on preparing his equipment, trying to dismiss his unease. "Where did you live before coming to Blackwood Manor?" Clark asked, keeping his tone conversational as he adjusted the camera settings. "I have always been here," Frederick replied. "And I have never been here." Clark looked up from his camera. "That's quite the riddle, young man." Frederick's face remained solemn. "It is not a riddle, Mr. Clark. It is the truth. They brought me here to replace the boy who was taken." "Taken?" Clark repeated, remembering Dr. Harris's mention of changelings. Frederick nodded. "The real Frederick Blackwood. He went into the woods 5 years ago and found the hollow hill. He was curious, you see. Children always are. He went inside, and they took him. So they sent me in his place." Clark felt a knot forming in his stomach. The boy's matter-of-fact tone made the fantastical tale all the more disturbing. "And who are they, Frederick?" "The fair folk, the hollow people, those who live beneath and beyond." Frederick's eyes suddenly seemed older, filled with knowledge no 8-year-old should possess. "They sent me to learn about human ways. I have learned much, but not enough. I still cannot make the shoe stay tied." Clark glanced at the boy's left foot, where the shoelace dragged on the floor. "Is that why your shoe is always coming unlaced?" Frederick looked down at his foot with mild curiosity, as though observing something unrelated to himself. "My foot does not belong in this world, Mr. Clark. The human craft of shoes and laces cannot bind it." Clark swallowed hard. He told himself the boy was simply repeating stories he had heard, or perhaps playing an elaborate game. Yet there was something in Frederick's demeanor that defied such rational explanations. "I'm ready to take your photograph now, Frederick," Clark said, retreating to the familiar territory of his profession. "Please sit straight and look directly at the camera." Frederick complied, his posture perfect and his expression serene. As Clark prepared to expose the plate, the boy spoke again. "Mr. Clark, would you like to see where I come from?" Before Clark could respond, the lamp on the table flickered violently, then went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Clark gasped, reaching blindly for his own lamp, but it too had extinguished. "Frederick?" he called, his voice tight with fear. "Are you there?" There was no answer, but Clark sensed movement in the darkness, a subtle shift in the air, as though something were circling him. He fumbled in his pocket for matches, his fingers trembling. "Frederick, this isn't amusing. Answer me, boy." A soft voice came from directly behind him, causing Clark to spin around. "I am not a boy, Mr. Clark." Clark struck a match, its small flame casting long shadows on the walls. Frederick stood before him, but something had changed. Though the child's form remained, his eyes now glowed with an inner light that was decidedly not human. "What are you?" Clark whispered, the match burning down toward his fingers. Frederick smiled, a gesture that transformed his face into something ancient and knowing. "I told you, I am a replacement, a changeling, as your people call us. I was sent to learn about humans, but I have learned enough now. It is time for me to return home." The match burned Clark's fingers, and he dropped it with a curse. In the renewed darkness, he felt a cold hand grasp his wrist. "Come, Mr. Clark. I want to show you the hollow hill before I leave. Perhaps you can photograph it for Mrs. Blackwood's collection." Clark tried to pull away, but the child's grip was impossibly strong. "Let me go, Frederick. This game has gone far enough." "It is not a game." The boy's voice had changed, becoming deeper and resonant, echoing in the small room. "And my name is not Frederick." Suddenly the door to the nursery burst open, and light spilled in. Mrs. Blackwood stood in the doorway, holding a lamp, her face a mask of fury and fear. "Frederick, release him at once!" The boy turned toward Mrs. Blackwood, still gripping Clark's wrist. "My time here is done, woman. The bargain is complete." Mrs. Blackwood stepped into the room, her free hand revealing an object she had been concealing in the folds of her skirt, an iron poker from the fireplace. "You will not leave until we say you may leave. That was the agreement. 7 years of service in exchange for the gift we gave your people." Clark looked between them in confusion. "What is happening here? What agreement?" Mrs. Blackwood kept her eyes on Frederick. "Stay out of this, Mr. Clark. This is a family matter." Frederick laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Family? You humans and your pretenses. Tell him, Victoria Blackwood. Tell him how you and your husband traded your own child for wealth and power." Clark stared at Mrs. Blackwood, whose face had gone white. "Is this true?" Mrs. Blackwood's hand tightened on the iron poker. "My husband made a discovery in the old woods on our property. A door where no door should be, and beyond it, beings who offered him everything he desired. All they asked in return was a child. You sold your son," Clark whispered, horrified. "We gave them Frederick in exchange for the means to build our fortune," Mrs. Blackwood replied, her voice hardening. "And they sent this creature in his place, to serve us for 7 years before returning to its kind. But the 7 years are not yet complete." Frederick's grip on Clark's wrist tightened painfully. 6 years, 6 months, and 6 days I have dwelled in this world of iron and lies. It is enough. I am leaving tonight, and I am taking something back with me, as is my right." Mrs. Blackwood raised the poker. "You will take nothing from this house." Frederick smiled again, that terrible ancient smile that had no place on a child's face. "Not from the house, Victoria Blackwood. From the cradle." A look of pure horror crossed Mrs. Blackwood's features. "No, you cannot take Henry. A child for a child," Frederick said. "That is the law of our kind. Your bargain bought you wealth, but now a payment is due." Clark, finding his voice, interjected. "This is madness. Frederick, or whatever you are, you cannot take a child." The creature wearing Frederick's form turned to Clark, its eyes glowing brighter. "You have seen my true nature in your photographs, Edmund Clark. You know what I am. This is not your concern." "I'm making it my concern," Clark said, surprising himself with his resolve. "I won't allow you to take Henry or any other child." Frederick's expression darkened. "And how will you stop me, photographer? With your camera? Will you capture my soul in one of your little boxes?" An idea suddenly occurred to Clark. a desperate notion based on folklore he had read years ago. "Iron," he said, looking at the poker in Mrs. Blackwood's hand. "The fair folk cannot abide iron." Before Frederick could react, Clark lunged toward Mrs. Blackwood and grabbed the iron poker from her grasp. He turned and thrust it toward the creature masquerading as a boy. Frederick hissed, releasing Clark's wrist and backing away. Where the iron had nearly touched him, the air seemed to ripple, as though the boy's form was merely a projection on water. "You dare to raise iron against me?" The voice that emerged from Frederick's mouth no longer sounded even remotely human. It resonated with power and age, shaking dust from the ceiling of the old nursery. Clark held the poker before him like a sword. "Leave this house. Return to your hollow hill or whatever realm you come from, but go without Henry or any other child." The creature's form flickered, Frederick's appearance momentarily replaced by something tall and slender, with limbs too long and a face too angular to be human. Then it stabilized, returning to the image of the boy. "You interfere in matters you do not understand, Edmund Clark," it said. "The bargain must be balanced. A child was taken. A child must be returned." Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward. "Then take me instead." Clark turned to her in surprise. "Mrs. Blackwood, I made the choice to sacrifice my son," she interrupted, her face resolute. "If someone must pay the price, it should be me, not Henry." Frederick tilted his head, studying her with inhuman eyes. "You would enter the hollow hill in place of the child? You would dwell among my kind until your mortal days end?" "I would," she replied without hesitation. The creature considered this, then nodded slowly. "The offer is accepted. The balance will be maintained." Clark intervened. "No, there must be another way." "There is no other way," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly. "I have lived with the consequences of our bargain for nearly 7 years, watching this creature wear my son's face, pretending to be part of our family. It is time I faced what I have done." Frederick, or the being that had been Frederick, extended a hand toward Mrs. Blackwood. "Come then, Victoria Blackwood. The door to the hollow hill will open at midnight. We shall depart together." Mrs. Blackwood turned to Clark. "Mr. Clark, I must ask a final service of you. Remain here tonight. Ensure that none of my children follow me when I leave with him, especially not my husband. Richard would try to stop me, but this price must be paid." Clark wanted to argue, to find some solution that didn't require such sacrifice, but the resignation in Mrs. Blackwood's eyes told him she had already accepted her fate. "I will stay," he promised. "But Mrs. Blackwood, are you certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything," she replied. "I have lived with this secret for too long, pretending that the creature before you was my son. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of my true child, lost in a realm I cannot comprehend. If my sacrifice can prevent another child from sharing that fate, then it is worth making." Frederick released Clark's wrist and moved to stand beside Mrs. Blackwood, an unsettling parody of filial devotion. "We have until midnight. I must prepare for the journey." Mrs. Blackwood nodded. "As must I. Mr. Clark, please come with me. There are arrangements to be made." In a daze, Clark followed Mrs. Blackwood from the nursery, still clutching the iron poker. They ascended the stairs in silence, the unreality of the situation leaving Clark struggling to process what he had witnessed. In Mrs. Blackwood's private sitting room, she wrote several letters with remarkable composure, sealing each with wax and the family crest. "These are for my children," she explained, handing them to Clark. "To be delivered after I am gone, and this one is for my husband." Clark accepted the letters reluctantly. "Mrs. Blackwood, I still believe there must be another solution. Perhaps we could somehow trick the creature, or—" "There is no tricking them, Mr. Clark. The fair folk operate by rules older than our civilization. A bargain made must be honored. A debt incurred must be paid." She looked out the window where the afternoon was fading into evening. "Richard and I were blinded by ambition. When we discovered the door in the ancient oak on our property, we thought we had found the key to unlimited prosperity. And indeed, every business venture succeeded, every investment multiplied. The price seemed distant then. Our youngest child, not yet even conceived." "You agreed to give them a child you didn't have?" Clark asked, incredulous. Mrs. Blackwood smiled bitterly. "They have their own sense of time. When they said your youngest child, we assumed they meant Frederick, who was then our youngest. But they meant the child who would be youngest when the 7 years were nearly complete, Henry, who wasn't born until almost a year after the bargain was struck." She turned back to Clark, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to age her before his eyes. I realized the truth only recently, when the creature that replaced Frederick began to watch Henry with increasing interest. It was then I understood the full import of our bargain. Clark shook his head, still struggling to accept the fantastic nature of the situation. And your husband? Does he know what's happening? Richard has convinced himself that we received our fortune through his business acumen alone. He chooses not to remember the hollow hill or the beings we encountered there. He even pretends that the thing wearing our son's face is truly Frederick. She sighed heavily. It is easier for him that way, I suppose. And the real Frederick? Is there any hope of recovering him? Mrs. Blackwood's expression darkened. The fair folk do not relinquish what they have taken. My son has lived among them for nearly 7 years now. Even if he could be returned, I fear he would no longer be the child we knew. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 6, startling them both. Mrs. Blackwood rose from her desk. I must see to the children's dinner and bid them good night. It will be the last time. What should I tell them? Clark asked. What should I tell your husband? The letters will explain everything, she replied. As for tonight, Richard is away on business in London. He will not return until tomorrow. By then, it will be done. Clark spent the next hours in a state of nervous anticipation, pacing the guest room where Mrs. Blackwood had installed him. Occasionally, he heard the normal sounds of the household, children's voices, servants moving about, the distant clatter of dinner being served and cleared. It all seemed surreally ordinary given what was to transpire at midnight. At 11:30, a soft knock came at his door. When he opened it, Mrs. Blackwood stood there, dressed in a traveling cloak despite the warm spring evening. It's time, she said simply. They descended through the house in silence, passing sleeping servants and darkened rooms. In the entrance hall, Mrs. Blackwood paused before a portrait of her family, all 6 children arranged around their parents, Frederick standing slightly apart, his left shoe conspicuously absent from the painting. I commissioned this last year, Mrs. Blackwood said quietly. The artist could not seem to capture Frederick's left foot properly. After 7 attempts, I told him to leave it out entirely. They continued outside, where the night air carried the scent of blooming flowers and damp earth. A nearly full moon illuminated the gardens and the path that led toward the woods at the edge of the Blackwood property. As they walked, Clark suddenly realized they were not alone. Frederick, or the creature wearing Frederick's form, was walking beside them, moving so silently that Clark had not noticed his presence until now. The door will open soon, the changeling said, its voice once again carrying that unsettling resonance. They entered the woods, following a path that grew increasingly faint until it disappeared altogether. Still, Mrs. Blackwood moved forward with purpose. As though drawn by some invisible thread, Clark followed, the iron poker still clutched in his hand, though he no longer believed it would be needed. After what seemed like an hour, but might have been merely minutes, time seemed to flow strangely in the darkness of the woods. They reached a clearing dominated by an enormous oak tree. Its trunk was so wide that it would have taken 5 men with outstretched arms to encircle it, and its branches reached toward the moon like supplicating hands. The ancient oak, Mrs. Blackwood murmured, the guardian of the door. As the moon reached its zenith, a change came over the massive tree. A seam of silver light appeared in its trunk, widening slowly to reveal an opening that should not have been possible. Inside was not the wood and heartwood one would expect, but a corridor of shimmering light that seemed to extend far beyond the physical confines of the tree. Frederick stepped toward the opening, his form shifting and elongating until he no longer resembled a human child at all, but a tall, slender being with luminous eyes and features of unearthly beauty. The door is open, the being said in a voice like distant bells. Come, Victoria Blackwood. Your new home awaits. Mrs. Blackwood turned to Clark one last time. Remember your promise, Mr. Clark. Protect my children. Make sure they understand that I chose this fate willingly. Clark nodded, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. Part of him still insisted that this was all some elaborate hallucination, that perhaps he had been drugged or was in the grip of a fever dream. But the cool night air on his face and the solid weight of the iron poker in his hand spoke of reality. Mrs. Blackwood stepped toward the shimmering doorway. As she reached the threshold, she looked back at the world she was leaving behind, her face illuminated by the otherworldly light. Goodbye, Mr. Clark. Remember us. She stepped through the door in the oak, the changeling following close behind. As soon as they passed through, the opening began to close, the seam of light narrowing until it was just a sliver, then vanishing completely, leaving only the ancient oak tree standing silent in the moonlight. Clark stood in the clearing, the iron poker hanging forgotten at his side, staring at the spot where Mrs. Blackwood had disappeared. After several minutes, he turned and began the long walk back to Blackwood Manor, his mind struggling to reconcile what he had witnessed with his understanding of the world. When he reached the house, all was quiet. He entered through the servant's door, making his way to the guest room where his few possessions remained. He had no idea what the morning would bring, how he would explain Mrs. Blackwood's absence, how the children would react to her letters, or what Mr. Blackwood would do when he returned from London to find his wife gone. In the privacy of his room, Clark opened his camera case and removed the glass plate he had exposed in the basement nursery, the photograph of Frederick that he had never completed developing. On impulse, he packed his portable developing equipment and slipped out to the manor's washroom, where he could work without disturbing the household. Under the dim red light of his developing lamp, Clark processed the plate, watching as the image gradually appeared in the chemical bath. What emerged was not the portrait of a solemn boy in a sailor suit, but something else entirely. A figure tall and inhuman, with elongated limbs and features that seemed to shift even within the fixed medium of the photograph. Only the left shoe remained recognizable, resting on the floor, while the foot that should have been inside it hovered several inches above. Clark stared at the image, the final proof that what he had experienced was real. He carefully packed away the photograph with his equipment, uncertain what he would do with it. Perhaps it would serve as evidence of the truth behind Frederick Blackwood's identity, or perhaps it would be dismissed as a photographic trick or aberration. As dawn approached, Clark sat by the window of his guest room, watching as the first light of day touched the gardens of Blackwood Manor. In a few hours, the household would awaken to find Mrs. Blackwood missing. The children would receive their mother's letters, and life at the manor would never be the same. Clark thought of the real Frederick Blackwood, lost for 7 years in the realm beyond the oak tree. He thought of Mrs. Blackwood, who had sacrificed herself to save her youngest child from a similar fate, and he thought of the changeling, the creature that had lived among humans, wearing a child's form like an ill-fitting garment, its true nature revealed only by a perpetually unlaced left shoe that never quite touched the ground. In the early light, Clark made a decision. He would deliver Mrs. Blackwood's letters as promised, then leave Thornfield immediately. He would pack away the photograph of the changeling and never show it to another living soul. Some truths were too strange, too terrible to be shared. As the sun rose over Blackwood Manor, Edmund Clark gathered his belongings and prepared to depart, carrying with him the knowledge that beneath the orderly surface of the world, he knew lay another realm, a place of ancient bargains and hollow hills, where the fair folk waited beyond doors in ancient oaks, and children with unlaced shoes were not always what they seemed. Years later, when Clark had established himself as one of London's premier portrait photographers, he would sometimes bring out the photograph taken in that basement nursery, studying the shifting, otherworldly figure with its hovering foot and unlaced shoe. He never spoke of what had happened at Blackwood Manor, not even when news reached him of Richard Blackwood's financial ruin and subsequent suicide, or of the manor's abandonment. Only once did he break his silence, when a well-dressed man brought his family to Clark's studio for a portrait. Among the children was a boy of about 8, whose left shoelace refused to stay tied despite repeated attempts to secure it. As the family posed before his camera, Clark leaned down and whispered to the boy, "Tell them I know what you are." The child's eyes met his, ancient and knowing in a young face, and a smile spread across features that momentarily seemed to shift and change before settling back into human form. The boy said nothing, but when the photograph was developed, his left foot hovered imperceptibly above the floor, the shoelace trailing on the ground beneath it. Clark filed the portrait away with the one from Blackwood Manor, a second piece of evidence of a world beyond the one most people knew. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was full, he would walk in the woods outside London, searching for ancient oaks and doors that opened onto realms of wonder and terror. He never found another, but sometimes, standing very still in the darkness, he thought he could hear Mrs. Blackwood's voice carried on the wind, whispering, "Remember us." And so he did, preserving the story of 6 children who smiled sweetly in a photograph from 1912, until you noticed the third one's left shoe, unlaced and hovering just above the ground, a sign that not everything in the world was as it appeared to be.